to talk about the SEC's most recent guidance note on the care obligation and the importance of assessing reasonably available alternatives. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation, as you just noted, and we plan to share the content, including the slides from today's session, with you. As always, we encourage your engagement and your dialogue throughout today's session. Please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom module to submit any questions for our panelists. We've allotted time, like I said off the top, to address any of these questions at the end of today's session. And as some of you may also be working from home, you may hear some background noise from time to time. We sincerely appreciate your understanding. And so to kick things off, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's get started with Mr. Summerfield.
Thank you, Parham. Jim Summerfield. I work for Wintrust Wealth Management in Chicago. I've been actually a compliance officer for over 20 years in the compliance industry and in the financial services industry for around 27 years. My job and responsibility really is to not only develop and implement, but also manage our ongoing compliance program here at Wintrust Wealth Management. And I'm also a member and chair of our platform committee. So a lot of involvement in terms of dealing with compliance issues.
Thank you, Jim. Mr. Hanna?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Issa Hanna. I'm a partner at Eversheds Sutherland. I regularly counsel broker-dealer and investment advisor clients on compliance with the standards of conduct that are applicable to their businesses. So I'm very happy to be here today and talk about these topics. Thanks.
Thank you, Issa. Richard? You are on mute, sir.
Sorry about that, Parham. Just before I forget, I'm totally blind. Can everyone see me okay? Just want to make sure. Sorry.
Your camera's not on, Richard.
The camera. Okay. Sorry about that.
It's all
How
good.
about now?
Perfect.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yes, Richard Chen. I've been practicing the investment management space for about 25 years. I currently own my own law firm practice, Richard L. Chen PLLC, which provides regulatory advice with respect to broker-dealers and investment advisory firms. We also do corporate work, commercial work, M&A, employment planning, and private fund work for investment advisory firms and other work for broker dealers as well.
Wonderful. Welcome, Mr. Chen. And Randy?
Thanks, Parham. Randy Barnes, Director of our Product and Sales Engineering at InvestorCOM. Responsibility is really driving towards working with our clients in the industry and the beautiful folks on the phone here to understand pain points and come up with solutions that can really help the broker-dealer and investment advisor industry on how to make the best out of a bad situation when it comes to our wonderful regulatory and compliance landscape.
Thanks, Randy. And along with Randy, I also work in the product function along with engaging regulators from time to time to talk about some of these topics that are front and center for our clients. If you haven't heard about InvestorCOM, we are a leading software provider in this particular space, helping financial advisory firms as well as call it investment management or wealth management firms mitigate compliance risk in as intuitive of a manner as possible. So with that exciting backgrounder, let's begin. We've got an all-star lineup of speakers and topics, but before we set up this webinar, we thought we want to hear from you. We asked you a set of questions about your journey with regulation best interests, the care obligation, along with how are you dealing with the requirements to date. So here we go. The first question was, and to get us started, what is the biggest area of enforcement that you perceive to be front and center for the wealth management market. And the majority believe the assessment of reasonably available alternatives is going to be an area of enforcement. Just knowing that we ask this question from time to time, there has been some, we are seeing some uptick on the rollover recommendation side as well. And so, hey, if it ain't the Department of Labor who's going to be looking at that, it appears that folks who are attending today's call also believe rollover recommendations may be an area of Reg BI enforcement on the forefront. Let's move things forward. Then we asked, well, okay, it's given the backdrop around enforcement, how are you making best interest recommendations across products, rollovers, and account type recommendations, which we'll talk about a bit more today. And the general consensus is clear. To date, lots of folks in the industry are still tackling these sets of requirements manually, which we'll talk a lot about as well. Having said that, there is about 13 to 20%, roughly speaking, of folks who have adopted technology. So our bias aside, we do advocate for that approach, stating the obvious. So we asked a couple more questions on this front. The recent SEC guidance note talks a lot about the importance of documentation of costs and reasonably available alternatives. So we asked, against that backdrop, and considering the best interest retail recommendations, how are you documenting the assessment of costs and reasonably available alternatives? And as the guidance noted, there's specific language around the necessity of assessing reasonably available alternatives. To date, the data speaks for itself. 64% indicated that they rely on financial advisors, financial professionals to self-attest that they're conducting this analysis. Having said that, 22% responded and suggested that they're relying on technology to capture that assessment. Take a deep breath. There's a couple more poll slides I'll share with you. So again, given the guidance note and the call out specifically around the timing of conducting the reasonably available alternatives analysis, we asked you, how and when do you assess reasonably available alternatives? I thought the responses here were particularly interesting because the guidance note came out and said, look, we expect this analysis to happen at the time of the recommendation and in as early in the process as possible. Having said that, it looks like, and this is consistent with what Randy and I have been hearing in the marketplace, that some folks are still relying on back-end surveillance systems. As you can see by the data, it confirms that notion to consider reasonably available alternatives and compare costs. Okay. Let's move things forward one more. And so we also asked about what process do you use to assess reasonably available alternatives when making product recommendations? And this one is particularly nuanced because the guidance was fairly clear in what they expect, what the staff expect to see when it comes to this. What's interesting is there isn't as much consistency across the industry, with 38% saying we do not have a consistent process. Meanwhile, we get this question often, do you consider mutual funds to ETFs to other products, or should you compare a mutual fund to another mutual fund? So as you can see, the results here are mixed, okay? Folks, we're gonna dig into these data points a lot more throughout today's conversation. Let's get started. So on the agenda, we will begin with a conversation with a recap of recent SEC and FINRA guidance related to specifically the care obligation. We'll then dive into the recent bulletin that's been causing quite a bit of a stir in our client base surrounding the care obligation and the requirement to consider reasonably available alternatives. And finally, we'll talk about developing a consistent and repeatable process that's effectively ensuring that you're meeting the compliance requirements when it comes to the care obligation and assessing reasonably available alternatives. I'll call it RAA from time to time. Please don't shoot me. Finally, we'll have time allocated at the end of today's session to take up any of the questions that flow through my chat box. Let's get things started. And what we do know is that with the poll questions in mind, there has been a stream of regulatory guidance from the SEC, from FINRA, and post-Reg BI. What I want to do is start this recap. And Richard, maybe I can ask you this first question. Let's start with the March 2022 bulletin around account type recommendations. In this particular guidance note, there was mentioned very clear expectations around account type recommendations, specifically for duly registered advisors. Richard, what do you make of this particular bulletin? And you're on mute as far as I'm seeing.
Thanks, Param. So I think what the SEC was trying to convey is that it's when looking at the duty of the care obligations, it's important not only to look at individual investments, but or investment strategies, but also account type, particularly with respect to dual registered firms and representatives, and looking at the whether or not those account types are suitable. So, whether it's a brokerage account or advisory account, whether it's a wrap versus a non-wrap account, or whether you're talking about retirement plan account to retirement account rollovers, it's important to look at the account type and to think about, what are the services and products offered under those account types? What are the client's needs with respect to services, and also their preferences, and also what are the alternatives? I think that there are a few important takeaways from this staff bulletin that are notable. One is that if a firm doesn't have sufficient information about the individual needs and preferences of the client, they cannot make recommendations. And this is sort of notable with respect to the retirement plan rollovers. But also, it's important to note that the staff noted that it is important not only to look at the preferences of the individual clients, but also what their needs are, and to make an appropriate recommendation, not purely based on preferences of those clients. With respect to dual registered advisors, I think it was also noted that the advisor should make clear the capacity in which they're making the recommendation, whether it's in a brokerage rep capacity or as advisor rep capacity, and also to make clear any conflicts, to disclose those conflicts to clients when making those account type recommendations.
Thank you, Richard. Let's move forward because there's a continuum of staff bulletins or risk bulletins that have risk alerts that have come out, and I guess the sort of the next specific guidance note was surrounding the area of the risk alert from the SEC around deficiencies surrounding compliance with the care obligation. For this, maybe Isa, I can ask you that this Jan 30th Reg BI risk alert makes a few concrete compliance, brings to light a few concrete compliance deficiencies. From your perspective, what are they and what stands out to you the most?
Yeah, sure. Happy to touch on that. So, that risk alert was, fairly comprehensive from the perspective of Reg BI. Didn't just touch upon the care obligation, also addressed, commonly observed deficiencies and best practices in connection with other aspects of Reg BI, like, the conflict of interest obligation, the disclosure obligation, the compliance obligation. But given that the focus of today's, panel discussion is really around the care obligation or care obligations for broker dealers and investment advisors, I think it's worth calling out a few items under that risk alert just to kind of paint the overall picture here. So what did they say? What did the staff say? The Division of Exams say in this risk alert? Well, they said, as part of some examinations and review of firm practices, they picked up on common weak points with respect to policies and procedures that are designed to comply with the they're supposed to be designed to comply with the care obligation, and they provided a number of examples. First, they picked up on, certain policies and procedures that directed financial professionals in general to consider reasonably available alternatives, but did not provide any guidance as to how they should go about that process. So, for example, they thought that firms should be more specific about establishing the scope of alternatives to consider in certain circumstances, or the systems to use for considering reasonably available alternatives in formulating a recommendation. They also picked up on policies and procedures that were weak in that they directed financial professionals to consider costs without providing them any guidance as to how to do so. For example, they thought that firms should be more specific about which specific types of costs to consider, those including both direct and indirect costs, or what systems to use to analyze costs in formulating a recommendation. And then next, they said that sometimes they saw that firms created systems, whether manual or some sort of technology-based system that allowed financial professionals to evaluate costs or reasonably available alternatives, but they didn't see firms mandating their use. Or maybe they mandated, but they didn't have a process to determine if they were being used. So that's something that the staff views as important, because if you don't mandate their use, it's, in their view, it's hard to establish that you are enforcing your policies and procedures requiring those financial professionals to consider costs and reasonably available alternatives. And finally, they picked up on some firms that directed in their policies and procedures financial professionals to document the basis for recommendations, but didn't give them particular instructions as to when documentation would be necessary or appropriate, or the specific information to be gathered. So those are, just some things to highlight in that risk alert. As I said, there's a lot more to it than just a care obligation, but those are I think the main takeaways.
Thanks, Isa. Given what Isa just shared, Jim, maybe I can kind of point the mic your way, and given your vantage point as a practitioner, you see the statement that highlights the deficiencies. Isa quickly just highlighted a few key points that have come to his attention. The one specific piece that we've seen in here is we've seen the SEC call out specifically is implementing systems but not requiring documentation specifically. Again, going back to the question, as a practitioner, how do you combat this? How do you mitigate that risk?
No, it's a great question. I think at the end of the day, it starts with policies and procedures, right? I mean, what was the alert focused on? Poor policies and procedures, lack of detail, lack of specifics in terms of who's responsible for what, who's taking care of what. I can tell you that as a dual registrant at Wintrust, what we focused on was, one, developing good policies and procedures that are manageable, that make sense. Obviously, any procedure you put together, you want to make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing, right? There's nothing worse than creating this grand procedure and not being able to follow through on it. It's just a recipe for getting cited during an exam. So what we've done is we've focused on clear lines of responsibility and accountability amongst our leadership team, our compliance, our management. And what we do there is leverage technology tools to the extent possible to ensure that we've met the obligations of the rule, whether it be disclosure delivery, contact management in terms of documentation, as well as peer comparisons to ensure that we're considering those reasonably available alternatives. I will stress, though, that as many of you know, the SEC didn't require necessarily documentation around reasonably available alternatives. But that being said, the SEC is also the same organization that says if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, right? So, I think, and we'll talk about this later, my firm underwent an SEC BI exam, and we had a good amount of takeaways from that. But ultimately, what we found is that having those good policies and procedures, laying out clearly who's responsible for what the expectations are around our financial advisors and our financial professionals in terms of how they're conducting their recommendations with their customers and documenting those recommendations to ensure we've met our BI obligations has been critical, I think, to us, meeting the requirements here.
Thanks, Jim. Before we move on to the specific RIA requirements, Randy, you face many queries from our clients, right, around this notion of account type recommendations, specifically from dual registrants. If you could summarize, what are you seeing? How are our clients tackling it today? And what are they looking for in terms of transitioning their solutions from a manual process to a digital one?
Yeah, love the question because it's so timely. We've had conversations, 3 of them this week alone, around this exact topic. And I suspect that the answers I got were similar to the respondents that we saw before, which is a lot of them are still doing it manually. Check the box with an attestation and combined handwritten notes somewhere. That's certainly a popular thing that we're hearing. Another one is around potentially capturing this stuff within a new account form or a new account system. So, a couple of thoughts that as we talk to these folks, the check the box days, I think, are numbered. It's really hard to prove and monitor and surveil that analysis with that type of a system. The other piece too around the new account as the choke point, really logical for that to be a consideration for us in this industry, because that's what we've done before. It's so common for us to make sure that we can get the right information into that new account form because we know it's going to be signed and acknowledged by the investor. And so it kind of acts like a really good safety net. But if you don't have a new account at the tail end of the recommendation, you're kind of stuck then with a bit of a bifurcated process. So what we're talking to firms about what they're looking for is really a consistent way to do wherever they need to do it, right? We talked early on about early on in the process versus tail end of the process, consistency across custodians or, self-clearing relationships, especially for these dual registrants where, they've got to manage so many different things, having a consistent way to do it, and then being able to integrate where it needs to integrate, whether it be a CRM or a custodial system or a new account form or whatever the case may be. I think having that layer of consistency on the top end and then an integration capability makes this so much more adoptable by the field and supportable on the back end from a supervision perspective.
Thanks, Randy. I think, folks, that's we see some questions coming in. That's fantastic. We'll definitely save time to take them up. Maybe this is a good juncture for us to turn the page and get into why we've all been gathered here today, which is the SEC's guidance note specifically on the care obligation. And so for this one, let's get our sleeves rolled up. I thought the FAQs are a great step in providing clarity for the industry. The goal of today is to draw out the key points that we've gleaned through the exams, as well as conversations with the regulators themselves, in terms of what are the key points to look at, consider, adopt when it comes to the particular FAQs that came out most recently. Richard, maybe I can ask you to jump in on the first question here, and in as clear of a way possible. I believe the SEC has called out that the care obligation and the corresponding requirements of assessing reasonably available alternatives apply to both market segments, not just BDs, but also investment advisors. Would love to know your thoughts on, or if whether there's any clarification here is required.
Yeah, so to reading between the lines, I think the reason that there was a focus on making sure that, sort of cover both broker dealers and investment advisors is that, even though there may be sort of differences, some slight variations in terms of how Reg BI and fiduciary standard for advisors actually looks in practice, the fact is that they effectively still require the advisor to look at the best interests of the client, even if their roles look different, right? Where the advisor has an ongoing responsibility versus a broker dealer at the point in time of making the specific recommendation. They just wanted to make sure that it was clear that you have to undertake these obligations, right? Whether it is looking at the product, looking at the profile of the client, or looking at alternatives, that they wanted to make sure that they wanted to emphasize that these obligations were much more similar than they are different.
Amen to that. I think that's fairly clear to me as well, and thank you for clarifying that, Richard. Jim, I'm sure you've contemplated the decision of a digital solution versus a manual one at your firm, and given your expertise in this area, can you walk us through your specific decision-making process around that particular question?
Yeah, ultimately resources are limited, right? I mean, if you're an investment firm, first of all, your financial advisor's focus should be working with your customers, ensuring that they're, meeting the needs of their customers. The enhanced compliance requirements that we've seen over the last 5 years, and this goes back to the original DOL fiduciary role that we talked about back in 2017. What we've come to find, and what we came to find as a firm, is that the burdens on both of our financial professionals as well as our compliance staff were just too great to have a manual process. We had to leverage technology. We had to find a way to streamline our ability to meet these regulatory requirements at the same time being as efficient as possible. Because again, you've only got so much time in the day, you've only got so many resources. And so what we did looking at that was make the decision that a digital solution, a technology solution was what was necessary. Then the question just became who was the best partner for us in terms of streamlining and integration and other opportunities to, again, be as efficient as possible in terms of addressing the needs of the regulation as well as the needs of our clients. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So how do we bring them together?
Amazing point. And I think Randy's has actually attested to this as well, right? You can't just be a net new process in isolation. It needs to weave between different technology stacks. And that's definitely front and center for us. Isa, one of the other pieces that Randy will attest, Randy, if we're talking about you a lot, will attest is we often receive similar questions around the requirements of comparing reasonably available alternatives. Do you think there is any more ambiguity following this guidance note around the intention behind assessing costs and available alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when Reg BI first came out, folks kind of pointed to the fact that the rule itself, the text of the rule itself did not say anything about the consideration of reasonably available alternatives. And the fact that you had to, dig into the hundreds of pages of that, the accompanying adopting release and pinpoint, a handful of pages within that release to see that, the commission viewed the care obligation as including, among other things, a requirement to consider reasonably available alternatives. So, I know around that time, people, took positions that, well, if it's not within the text of the rule itself, how can it be a requirement? Over time, I think it's fair to say that both the SEC and FINRA staff do view this as a requirement. You have to look no further than the recent SEC staff bulletin on the care obligations for BDs and IAs. Where there's a point blank question, FAQ number 9. Should I consider reasonably available alternatives when recommending or providing advice about investments or investment strategies to retail investors? And point blank, the SEC staff says yes. You could also look at the FINRA 2023 exam priorities that came out a couple months ago, where they repeatedly state there's there's a common they commonly find exam deficiencies around failure to sufficiently consider reasonably available alternatives. So the regulators are looking for compliance with this. There's no question about that, and I think it's pretty much settled at this point that there's an obligation to do something on this point.
Thanks, Isa. Maybe I'll take a quick research commercial break for a quick second, just to kind of highlight to folks that InvestorCOM independently did an analysis. We had a firm who had basically used our technology to make peer compare or compare reasonably available alternatives across a 2-year period. Okay, and the results of that were somewhat significant when we looked at the 2-year period, and it's call it a time series data point. And this notion of comparing reasonably available alternatives from the sheer data set that we looked at was illuminating. I thought it would be worthwhile to quickly share with you, because what we identified in looking at that sort of time series of data points was that the relative metrics of those recommendations, or the quality of those product recommendations, were improving over time. Specifically, the average cost measured by the expense ratio of the product through that comparative analysis decreased by 35%. The historical returns, again, by doing that apples to apples comparison, improved by 39%. Again, the data point measured here is the 3-year historical rate of return figure, as well as the risk measured by a 3-year standard deviation also improved. So I do want to kind of come back to this, in my opinion at least, or maybe through the InvestorCOM lens, this notion of comparing available alternatives, or comparative analysis, which is also touched on in the guidance note, does tend to improve that outcome for the end investor. So let me just go say that quickly, and maybe come back to some questions here that we have, and we're seeing as well in the chat box. There's mention, Isa, specifically about firms and advisors knowing the product they're recommending to their clients. Call it having knowledge about the products. How can firms and financial professionals evidence their assessment of costs and available alternatives in your respective view?
So, I mean, I think, when it comes to knowledge regarding, the available kind of product shelf, I think you have to, view that from the lens of essentially your product due diligence and training process, right? So, the Reg BI's care obligation has, 3 components, right? And they loosely match what, FINRA's old suitability rule. I shouldn't say it's old, but it's still there. 2111 is still there. It just applies to, recommendations to institutional customers now. But, it generally lines up with, the 3 components of that. There's, reasonable basis, there's customer specific, and then there's that quantitative element, right? So in the, in the staff bulletin, they spend a fair amount of time talking about, what that reasonable basis best interest process should look like, to make sure that, there's a reasonable understanding of, the products on your shelf. And, at FAQ number 2, they provide some ideas of factors that you would want to consider as part of evaluating the potential risks, rewards, and costs of an investment or investment strategy. And, having that understanding is kind of like a critical, bit of information that you would need in the SEC staff's view to help you meet the reasonable basis component of the rule, right? When you're dealing with the individual customer, how can you match, a product to a particular customer's investment profile if you don't understand, the features of the product, the potential risks, rewards, and costs associated with that product. So, it's a multi-step process, and the staff provides, some pretty specific suggestions here about essentially what your product due diligence questionnaire should include when you're, trying to get an understanding of certain products. And I think it's particularly important to look at these, these elements that the staff lays out when you're dealing with particularly complex, risky, and costly product types, and also product types that present, enhanced or significant conflicts.
Thanks, Isa. That's super helpful. Let's bring it to the practitioner's table, and maybe Jim, ask you another question related to a key principle identified in the guidance note in that firms and financial professionals should have a consistent process. So whether it's Parham or Randy, the process of considering available alternatives and costs should be consistent. And starting from a broad level all the way down to drilling into a narrow range of reasonable alternatives. Can you share how you've tackled this particular piece?
Sure, happy to. So I'll start off by saying that as a firm, after reading through all the guidance and when we established our policies and procedures around regulation best interest, we did not require our financial advisors to document every single recommendation that they made. That just was not possible, right? The focal point, as I recall, when we were putting our procedures together was, anytime you're making a recommendation of a new product or service to a customer is when you were really needing to focus in on that best interest advice and the documentation surrounding it. The one thing I want to focus on when it came specifically to the product recommendations, we started off by focusing in on the complex, high cost, limited liquidity products. We looked at those as sort of representing the greatest amount of risk to our customers. And really, when you read through what BI is all about, and cost as being obviously a key consideration, we looked at that as sort of being the real nuts and bolts of what we needed to focus in on. So by doing that, we established a simple process, which basically was focused on, although more manual at the time, addressing, if you're buying a structured product, a variable annuity, a leveraged ETF, or other products that have levels of complexity, higher cost, how do we provide a disclosure, acknowledgement, document our due diligence and the best interest advice, again, from a reasonable basis standpoint. And so what we had done is we had generated a disclosure form that was signed by the client, provided, if you think back to FINRA's old requirements around variable annuity sales, it was the plain English, disclosure. We sort of took that approach with our complex limited liquidity products and use that. Now, obviously, that doesn't cover everything from a reasonable available alternatives perspective, right? There's considerations, like you said, other product types, mutual funds, other different types of investments. So the key there was, looking at how we were going to go about implementing that process and being consistent in that approach from the standpoint that we conducted a number of training sessions. We've laid out very clearly in our policies and procedures, this is what's required, this is when it's required, and this is how we go about as a compliance team ensuring from an oversight perspective that we've met and complied with our policies and procedures to meeting that reasonably available alternatives expectation and documentation.
Thanks, Jim. Plenty of follow-up questions to ask you, but maybe Isa, I can kind of skip to you quickly. Just keeping it within the guidance note, what I thought was particularly interesting in terms of a call out, and this actually came up in the earlier poll results, is this other principle that's been called out, and the notion that the RAA process or assessment should happen earlier on in the process when formulating a recommendation to retail investors, rather than this retrospective exercise. Super curious about your thoughts on what do you make of that particular statement in the guidance note.
I don't know that this should necessarily take folks by surprise. I think it's kind of more of like a reminder probably, but if you're a firm that's kind of relying on retrospective type of reviews or surveillance or something like that to consider reasonably available alternatives, you're probably going to want to take a second look at that to make sure that you're in compliance with the staff's expectations.
All right, say it as it is, Isa. I love it. So maybe Randy, I can kind of come to you for the next question, and then Richard, I'll come to you. This particular question around early in the process versus retrospective process, Randy, has come up quite often in our conversations with our clients. What frameworks do you think you'd suggest that our clients can, or not necessarily our clients, firms in the industry can apply to assess or meet the requirements around assessing reasonably available alternatives with confidence?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to be kind of doubling down on Jim's comments from a little bit earlier, right? Making sure that, and even East as well, like making sure at the top of the funnel, that you've got good products in place and you've got a process that clearly can drive into what are the right types of products for the investor based on their profile. And then next layer down, have that framework or process around what's reasonably available now within that asset class, right? And this needs to be consistent and to Jim's point, really well defined. Because this is all then going to go back to the adoption factor. Like if you have inconsistencies or it's not clear what's going on, or when I do X versus when I do Y, you're either not going to get adoption or they're just going to do it incomplete, and you're going to have a bit of a buzz storm on your a storm on your hands. So that would be one key thing. And I think also from the framework of the actual analysis, I would say it can't. We talk a lot about the cost, right? It's a big component, but you need to make sure that it's not just a race to the bottom for cost, right? I think that's been abundantly clear as well. And so making sure that whatever framework you have, it can also bring into consideration, even at the individual RAA level, those elements of risk and return as part of that process. It's super important.
Thanks, Randy. Richard, maybe I'll ask you this particular question. And there's a specific call out in the guidance note that the assessment of reasonably available alternatives, or this cost comparison exercise, needs to be more than just comparing share classes, right? What do you make of that particular point? If a firm asks you that question, how would you advise them?
Yeah, so I think this was the staff's attempt to right-size the obligation with respect to the universe of, sort of investments that are considered reasonably available alternatives and how advisors should think about right-sizing that obligation. I think this component of it was designed to make sure advisors are aware, hey, it's not simply that you look at the same, the different flavors within the same investment. You have to look broader than that. For instance, talking about this share class issue, for instance, if there's an ETF that accomplishes the same, sort of objectives for a client as the ETF or with the mutual fund, the share class, that you're considering, then, it's advisable that you look simply beyond a share class within that mutual fund that's appropriate, that you have to think bigger. And I think that this was their attempt to show folks that you have to broaden the alternatives that you're looking at.
Thank you, Richard. Your point of view on this, and there's a few very specific call-outs and questions, and I love the FAQ format of this. And Isa, we get asked this question all the time around, well, do costs need to be considered every single time? And the guidance note was fairly clear in their response. What do you make of that particular point?
I think it is, in the text of Reg BI that, the customer specific best interest requirement explicitly requires you to consider cost, among other things, right? And I think one of the other panelists, made this point earlier. Cost is not the be all end all, and there are absolutely circumstances where the lowest cost product is not in the retail customer's best interest, right? But that you can't, and also you can't just satisfy your care obligation by just recommending the lowest cost option, right? You have to think about what's actually in that retail customer's best interest after considering their entire investment profile, right, and what their particular needs are. So bottom line, I think cost, I think the regulators have made it crystal clear that cost has to be a consideration. It's not the be all and end all, but it has to be considered as part of the process of arriving at a best interest recommendation.
Love it. Love it. And I love the FAQs. The answer was yes, period. Moving on. Okay, folks, let me ask one more question from our planned conversation, and then I'll jump into the questions that have come through the chat box. And folks, please, this is a great opportunity for us to get into a little bit of a lightning round and put our panelists to test. Make sure they've had their caffeine. But before we do that, I want to ask about the billion-dollar question. It comes up in every one of our webinars and every one of our conversations with our clients, and this notion that there needs to be documentation. Question 16 goes into it, and it's the last question, and I'd suggest maybe it's it should be read by most. Should firms document the evaluation of reasonably available alternatives? Mr. Hanna, any thoughts?
So, I would say that you would start with the Reg BI adopting release, right? They lay out what they believe, or the commission lays out what it believes on this topic. They note in the adopting release, that there's not necessarily a requirement to document the basis for, every single recommendation. They explicitly state that. And I'll also point out in the recent, staff bulletin that they say that again. That's what they lead off with in this FAQ number 16. There's not necessarily a requirement. But then, in the Reg BI adopting release, they state that broker dealers may wish to document an evaluation of a recommendation in certain contexts, especially in connection with complex, risky, or expensive products, or in connection with significant investment decisions such as rollovers and account type recommendations. So that's where they started. But I would say over time that there's been a bit of a moving target here. Where and I think what's doing the work here is some language in the adopting release where the commission says, broker dealers may wish to take a risk-based approach when deciding whether or not to document, certain recommendations. So that level of ambiguity regarding where that dividing line is between, the risks that would necessitate documentation or not is where you have some gray area, right? So that was kind of followed up by that March of 2022 staff bulletin, where the staff said it's their view that it's difficult for a firm to assess periodically the adequacy and effectiveness of its policies and procedures or to demonstrate compliance with its obligations to retail investors without documenting the basis for its account type and rollover recommendations. So you see a little bit of a different formulation there in the language. They say it's a staff's view as opposed to a commission requirement. And then they kind of introduce this new concept of the impact of a failure to document from a compliance obligation perspective. There's this component. It's kind of an underrated component in my view under Reg BI that that's a compliance obligation, right? And the staff is saying here that, well, if you want to meet your compliance obligation, you have to have essentially something to test against. You have to have some paperwork to look at to see if you're meeting your policies and procedures. And how do you do that? If how do you kind of show that your policies and procedures are being followed if you don't have contemporaneous documentation to actually look at? So they kind of introduced that concept. And then, in this recent, staff bulletin and FAQ 16, one that came out in the last few weeks, they kind of reprise that concept again about the compliance obligation. They say, in the staff's view, it might be difficult for a firm to demonstrate compliance with its obligations to retail investors or to periodically assess the adequacy and effectiveness of written policies and procedures without documenting the basis for certain recommendations. And they kind of take it to a different place that they hadn't really gone before. And then they say this could include documentation of the consideration of reasonably available alternatives. And they finished that FAQ by stating the staff believes documentation demonstrating that the financial professional considered reasonably available alternatives can be particularly important where a recommendation may seem inconsistent with the retail investor's investment objectives on its face and or poses conflicts for the firm or the financial professional. So, that's, I think like a moving of the target, so to speak, where the staff is kind of taking this, this view in a different direction. And, you might say this comes back to the principles-based nature of Reg BI or statements by the commission that you would take a risk-based approach when deciding whether or not to document. But we have a clear indication here that the staff is looking for documentation and more expansive situations.
Love it. Thank you for that insight and telling us the sort of the journey around documentation, at least from a guidance interpretation perspective. Thank you, Isa. Why don't we do this, folks? We have 8 minutes left. I've got a long list of questions, and maybe if you can put your over-caffeinated hats on and let's jump in. Richard, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. There's a specific question here that I think you can tackle, but if you can't, just say pass and we'll move on. Can you share your views on whether there is any daylight between Reg BI's requirements and the fiduciary responsibilities? Does Reg BI, in a way, set the floor for registered investment advisors?
Great question, and probably above my pay grade, to be honest with you, because I've been trying ever since we started this to figure it out. But I think the best answer to it is that from the staff's view and looking just at this guidance is that they've, like I was saying earlier implicitly, I think effectively they look at them the same. And that's just my viewpoint, but that's what I generally take away from it. If you ask me to parse it out more than that, I'd be hard pressed to. So.
Got it. Thank you for your insights on it. There's another excellent question that just trickled in, and it's around the notion of considering available alternatives outside of the firm's product offering. Any guidelines, anything that maybe Isa or Jim, as a practitioner, you want to shed on this?
Isa, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to like what's available, you actually have to be able to offer it, right? Like something is not available if it's not on your platform. So in terms of looking at what other firms are offering, I don't think that's necessarily required. And if you look at the Reg BI adopting release, they say that they acknowledge, the commission acknowledges that firms have completely open architecture product offerings, and there could be literally thousands of mutual funds or whatever and ETFs that might be available, and you're not obligated to look at every single one, right? So like you can, they acknowledge that you can undertake a process to define the scope of reasonably available alternatives that should be considered in certain circumstances, right? And there's not necessarily an obligation to consider everything that's available on an open architecture platform. But if you look at this FAQ guidance, and also the risk alert from January, I think what the staff is looking for is specific guidance to reps about what the universe should be in particular circumstances. That's going to go to your training and your policies, and that there should be like very specific directives to them about if a customer comes in with a specific investment objective, here's some here's step one, generally speaking at a high level, the asset classes or the different products with these particular features to kind of think about. And then once you kind of gotten past that process of identifying particular asset class or asset classes that would be in that customer's best interest, drilling down into the within the particular product lineup to figure out which particular investment is in their best interest. I think that's definitely an expectation. And then final point on this is the staff has made this clear, and I think the commission made this clear in the Reg BI adopting release as well. If you kind of limit the the universe of products that are available to your retail customers in some way, and there's a very very limited availability of certain products that might meet a particular need. You can't use that as a justification to meet your kind of reasonably available alternatives analysis or your care obligation generally, right? If you don't have something that can meet a retail customer's best interest, I think the staff would expect you to say, well, I don't have anything here to meet this obligation. You might want to consider some other service offering or something like that. So that's something else to consider, is that if you limit too much and you don't have something to offer, you can't just kind of try to square peg round hole it. You have to have something generally that can meet the potential needs of all your retail customers.
Thank you, Isa. Maybe we have time for one more, and Jim, I know I want to kind of double down on asking you a question. There's a lot of kind of questions that have come through this around the time it would take to assess available alternatives properly, around the necessity of documenting versus not. In your experience, is there an efficient way to kind of go through that process, assess available alternatives in a methodical, consistent manner, and then document it readily?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, a lot of financial advisors have in mind the type of product or service they want to offer based on the client's profile up front, right? I mean, to the discussion points we had earlier about, going back retrospectively versus thinking about it up front, I'd say the focal point has definitely got to be when you're reviewing the client's profile, the advisor or the professional should be looking at what are the options that can meet the client's needs. We've used the technology tools, as I mentioned before. The peer comparison tool was great because it gives you a snapshot immediately, right? So say you're an advisor, financial professional, you're leaning towards this particular fund. You can input that fund. Now you can look at comparisons regarding risk, regarding performance, regarding cost, right there on the screen, and considering what's available in sort of that class can help you to really narrow down in a very quick and timely fashion the different options that are available. In fact, many of our financial advisors have begun leveraging that peer comparison tool as a means to evaluate the offerings that they want to make to their customers. So they are using it as a precursor to the advice rather than a post, let's just check the box to meet the regulatory requirement. So I think that's been a really important development in our process at my firm.
Jim, thank you for the shout out, and thank you for your transparency and how you've been tackling the requirements. Isa, Richard, thank you as well. For folks who are, we're at the hour. For folks who have other questions, please reach out to us. We have a firm belief in the value of our offerings, as well as helping firms in the industry. With that said, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you all for spending an hour of your time with us.